Hi everyone, how you doing? Welcome to my room. It's the midweek now, so I just hope the week started well for you. It's beautiful weather here, and since nobody is really that interested in the weather, we might as well move to our topic. I was thinking recently about this question of intelligence and of how intelligence tends to be interpreted in various ways. It's not really that easy to arrive at a satisfactory understanding or definition of what intelligence is. And perhaps we could try to have a slightly, Jungian functional perspective on this question as well. Maybe this could be an interesting tool to help us do that. In fact, I think that paradoxically, as much as the Jungian analytical psychology, or based on the Myers-Briggs model, paradoxically, as much as these models might come across as boxing people in, they can provide a way towards conceiving of intelligence in a much more manifold, diversified manner, I think. We often hear we hear many things. Often these things are not very smart, paradoxically. Sometimes we hear people say, intelligence is your IQ. If you have a high IQ, you're very intelligent. If you have a low IQ, you're unintelligent. Maybe there's not really any kind of judgment of value involved in this, but there always is, I think, in my opinion. The judgment of value comes from the fact that the person has implicitly set the valuation in terms of the IQ test. And there is no real reason to do this. I think that it would be silly to argue that an IQ test does not measure intelligence in some way. Someone who scores very high in an IQ test, in my opinion, is undoubtedly intelligent in some way. But paradoxically, I think that, and I have to really stop saying paradox because it's been too many times. But paradoxically, this person who's intelligent and scoring high in the IQ test can be at the very same time quite unintelligent in other respects. And there seems to be not necessarily a duality of intelligence, but even a plurality of intelligence. What's very rare is not so much to find someone who's really intelligent, someone who's really smart. What's rarer, I think, is once we have embraced this more complex, manifold conception of intelligence. What's much rarer is to come across people who are intelligent in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different domains. And when I say domain, I mean not only, lots of intellectual domains. So for example, someone who's extremely gifted, not only in, let's say, literature, but also in philosophy, or someone who's gifted in, maybe across even like a slightly wider sort of spectrum, someone who's gifted in economics and arts or something like that, which is totally possible. Being gifted in arts not often conceived of as a sign of intelligence, but perhaps this is not so much the fault of art, and just as much the fault of the slight indeterminacy of the concept of intelligence. And so, as is my it's not really a habit yet, but as is my soon to become a habit, let us try to have a very quick look at immediate kind of definitions of intelligence. See what the internet says about intelligence. and I am given a French definition, which is not very satisfactory. So maybe I can look at the Merriam-Webster definition. Says the ability to learn or understand or deal with new or trying situations, the ability to apply knowledge to manipulate one's environments, or to think abstractly as measured by objective criteria. So you see that here, what's interesting is there is the potential for viewing intelligence in a manifolded way with the help of these two main definitions that Merriam-Webster proposes. But the manifoldness of these definitions still does not, I think, contain the full spectrum of what intelligence can mean. What is interesting about those definitions is that by speaking of intelligence as the ability to learn or understand or deal with new or trying situations, what we can see here is that this does not really discriminate in principle between what we call intellectual intelligence and practical intelligence, because of course when we think, we tend to think in terms of intelligence. A lot of the time we have this almost well, at least a lot of people have this almost innate tendency to consider that intelligence belongs to the mind, abstract mind, that is. So whether someone is very quick at resolving mathematical problems, or someone is very fluent in other languages, whether someone is very cultured, very erudite, which poses a problem because, for example, I do not think that erudition is even remotely the closest criterion for intelligence. I think it's possible and common to be erudite without being particularly intelligent, because at the end of the day, being erudite requires, it requires certainly a modicum of intelligence and the capacity for retention, for memory, but you don't need to be particularly sharp to remember things and to have read lots of things. Perhaps there's other skills that are involved in here that are not necessarily to do with intelligence. But in any case, both this definition about problem solving and being good at it, about being of sound and adaptive reasoning, is good already in terms of it's not discriminating between abstract intelligence and more practical intelligence, if we can use these terms. So perhaps in Jungian terms, we would think of the abstractly intelligence as the types that are predominantly N types, NE or NI types, either auxiliary or dominant, and then the more practically intelligent people as the S types, whether SC or SI in their dominant or auxiliary slot. So that in itself is good, because this definition from the dictionary is not one that is always embraced necessarily by people, but I think that it is more correct than a lot of the interpretations and preconceptions that people have, which is already good, because a lot of the time, as we had the opportunity of seeing recently, a lot of dictionary definitions are bad, deficient, imprecise, vague, obscure, and most of the time circular. It is not really circular in this case. It's defining intelligence in terms of skill, problem solving, reasoning, so that's okay. What you can notice that it leaves out, though, is maybe a whole spectrum that has to do with imagination and creativity. So, for example, and to come back to the whole question of the artistic intelligence, isn't that another dimension of intelligence? Just being able to not only having a very vivid imagination, being able to come up with scenarios and images in one's mind, and not only that, but being able to bring them to fruition by an act of talking, by an act of sentential description, an utterance, or sometimes in the domain of actual art, in a book or in a painting or in a piece of music. I mean, when we say that Beethoven, for example, or Mozart, or Philip Glass, to use a slightly more modern example, when we say that they're geniuses, do we really exclude the domain of intelligence from this question of genius? I mean, I think there is a link between both of them, but that this relationship between genius and intelligence only really becomes visible once we move past the merely cognitive focus or intellectual focus or abstract focus on what intelligence means. I like to refer sometimes to Van Gogh's painting At Heaven's Gate. So you can check it out, At Heaven's Gate, which represents like a man sitting on a chair, his face in his hands, and to me it very clearly portrays how Van Gogh perceives and understands and grasps depression. And in a way, it is one of the most clear, most intelligent, most refined, most acute, most moving, and most profound descriptions of what depression is. But he shows it artistically. He uses his skill and he shows it. It's a very complex process. It's not one that seems to require that many of the skills that are, of the abilities or faculties that are mentioned in these definitions, or even the traits of intelligence that we tend to think about when we define it, or when we think about people as being smart. And yet, it seems to me that clearly a very, very profound, deep, and great intelligence was mustered in making this painting. So there is this whole artistic, creative dimension of intelligence. Imaginative, creative, artistic perhaps belong to a certain region of the meaning of intelligence. Then there is this problem-solving aspect, this reasoning aspect. There's the logical dimension of intelligence, which is perhaps maybe more captured in the IQ tests, with the verbal reasoning, the more symbolic reasoning. These are two different things. For example, I think that I'm better at verbal reasoning than at symbolic and mathematical reasoning. Similarly to, I believe, Jordan Peterson, he says that in the video, and I remember that because I really identified with what he said. So be it practical or intellectual, so this is already a very interesting kind of complexification of the meaning of intelligence if we divide it into, and this is a very perfunctory kind of classification and division between types of intelligence that ultimately are all kind of bleeding into each other, the more rational part, the more practical part, and the more creative part. And I think that perhaps we can go into much more detail as regards what this creative, or we've already mentioned that it can express itself in a lot of different ways. Sometimes people express creative intelligence in a very striking and deep way without creating works of art, sometimes even by just talking. And then some people don't talk that much and don't necessarily seem sharp, and then they produce works of art that are amazing. Some of these composers, some of these writers, they're not necessarily going to strike you, or maybe even more so with painters, as being super sharp or fluent when you talk to them. They just express their intelligence through a different medium. So there are different kinds within this creative sort of region of intelligence, and then there is there is the intellectual dimension that I talked about, and maybe in this category we could distinguish between quickness and adaptiveness of reasoning, erudition, which personally I think does not rank very very high in this hierarchy of intelligence, but if there is such a thing, but you could argue that still requires a level of intelligence, being able to retain things and be able to not just retain things but to talk about things as if once you retain the information, link it together in giving an account, like a historical account. It's a very, very different kind of intelligence, even though it is an intellectual kind of intelligence, than the intelligence that reasons, the intelligence that just logically proceeds from A to B to C and is able to manipulate mathematical reasoning much quicker that kind of intelligence may not be erudite at all, and yet it is still very much a kind of intelligence. And there's another kind of intelligence that is abstract, which is the intuitive kind of intelligence, people who have insights, people who are able to see things differently. In philosophy, we have philosophers such as Wittgenstein or Nietzsche or Spinoza or even Schopenhauer or Heidegger, who Wittgenstein was also logically very, very, very intelligent, but maybe primarily the genius of these philosophers has to do with their being able to intuit things in a different way, having these flashes, and that's not really erudition. In fact, a lot of these philosophers, maybe with the exception of Heidegger, were not particularly erudite. They knew things, but they were very focused on their thing. They were not particularly logical, with the exception of maybe Wittgenstein and Spinoza. And even them, as logical beings, would not compare to a pure mathematician of genius, But they had this insightful kind of intelligence, this ability to just see things people don't see. So that's yet another kind. And then in the practical domain, if we return to the practical domain, of course you have different ways of being intelligent as well. You have ways of being intelligent with the problem solving, but you also have ways of being intelligent with your body. If you're a dancer, or if you're a stunt person, you have ways of being intelligent with cooking. There are ways of being intelligent with a lot of different things. And again, we see the very great dimension, being intelligent with logistically organizing things. That requires a tremendous kind of intelligence, which I do completely lack, by the way. I lack a lot of intelligence in most domains. Hopefully I have a bit of it in the intellectual domain or the creative domain, maybe a bit, I'm hoping, but I'm not sure. But this is only to just give you a snippet of how very quickly we can arrive at a picture of what intelligence means that is incredibly diverse, so diverse as to become almost impossible to really capture as a unity, as a unitary thing. I think the promise of Jungian analytical psychology and Myers-Briggs model, which has already been perceived by other people, of course, is that with reference to the functions, there is a way of conceiving of the hierarchies of the functions as unpacking a certain pattern of intelligence in relation to a certain field. So perhaps if you're like an ISTP, you're going to be in the domain of practical problem solving intelligence, broadly speaking. This is going to be your go-to, although you may very also be creative and other things, but maybe this is going to be the directionality of where your intelligence goes. Maybe if you're an SP type, you're going to be more in the creative domain. Maybe you're going to be more in the domain of expression of intelligence with the body. If you're an NI type, you're probably going to be in the domain of intellectual, insightful intelligence. A TI type would maybe be in the domain of logical intelligence. Maybe a type that has a lot of SI could be in the domain of intelligence that is of an erudite kind of type. And then in the creative domain, you can, that is accessible in principle to all different types, but you could think that perhaps the feelers that use NE or NI are going to be drawn towards this category of intelligence because they will be able to, imagination is very linked to states of feeling and wanting to express those states of feeling as well. So perhaps there's a link there as well, potential for a link, but because everybody has a very unique kind of stack, which is not ever linked completely in a straightforward way to the stacks that we see theoretically on paper. Maybe to each unique stacking of every unique person, there corresponds, in a formal sense at least, their unique kind of intelligence, which is not quite the same as any other kind of intelligence. It congregates within itself all the different aspects that altogether make up how each person is uniquely intelligent. And this is the link that I saw between these different topics. So let me know what you think in the comments, guys, and I will be talking to you very soon. I hope you decide to bear with me until now, because it's been a while. See ya.